like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
Welcome to another deep dive. You sent over some really interesting articles all about virtual reality, and I'm excited to dig in with you.
Yeah.
We've got excerpts from the Wikipedia article on virtual reality.
Okay.
And honestly, just reading the intro was enough to get my mind buzzing with questions.
It's such a fascinating field.
It is.
Isn't it? Even just the definition of VR, a simulated experience that uses 3D near-eye displays and pose tracking to give the user an immersive feel of a virtual world, and it really just scratches the surface of what's happening.
Yeah. So we know VR aims to make you feel like you're somewhere else, but did you know that even back in 1962,
Wow.
people were trying to create these immersive experiences? The Sensorama machine, which the article mentions, used sounds, smells, even vibrations to try to pull you into the experience.
Oh, wow.
It's incredible to think how far back this human fascination with virtual worlds goes.
It really does.
Yeah.
It speaks volumes about that deep-seated desire to push the boundaries of our senses. And while the Sensorama was quite the spectacle, the real game changer in terms of head-mounted displays was the Sword of Damocles in 1968.
Yeah.
The article says this thing was so massive it had to be suspended from the ceiling. It's a far cry from the sleek VR headsets we have today.
Can you imagine trying to lose yourself in a virtual world while dangling from the ceiling? Talk about a neck workout.
Yeah.
But even those clunky early attempts paved the way for the VR revolution we're seeing today.
Absolutely. The article does a great job of tracing that evolution through the decades.
Right.
From the pioneering work of Jaron Lanier in the 80s, which really helped define the field, to companies like Sega and Nintendo testing the waters with VR gaming. It's been a fascinating journey.
And then in the 2010s, things really started to take off, right?
Yeah.
The Oculus Rift felt like a turning point, bringing high-quality VR experiences to a wider audience. And then other major players like HTC and Sony jumped on board.
What's interesting, though, is that it wasn't just gaming companies driving this resurgence.
Right.
The article mentions Facebook, now Meta, of course, acquiring Oculus VR in 2014.
Right.
That move signaled a shift. Suddenly, the tech giants saw the potential of VR beyond entertainment.
That's true. And their massive investments in the metaverse really highlight how much they believe in VR, shaping the future of how we interact with technology and with each other.
Totally.
Yeah.
Speaking of the metaverse, we'll get to that later, but first I'm curious to unpack how this technology actually works.
Okay.
The article touches upon high frame rates and low latency being crucial for creating that sense of immersion.
Yeah.
Can you break that down for us? What makes those factors so important?
You know, I was wondering about that too.
Okay.
I understand what those terms mean individually,
Okay.
but I'm not sure how they work together to make VR feel real.
Think of it like this.
Okay.
Imagine watching a movie where the frames skip or there's a lag between the audio and video.
Yeah.
It completely breaks the illusion, right?
Right.
The same principle applies to VR. To trick your brain into believing you're in a different world, the visuals need to update incredibly smoothly and respond instantly to your movements.
Okay, that analogy makes total sense.
Yet.
It's like if you turn your head and the virtual world doesn't keep up, your brain immediately knows something's off.
Right.
It's that seamlessness that makes all the difference.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is that modern VR headsets actually rely on much of the same tech we already have in our smartphones.
Oh, wow.
Gyroscopes, motion sensors, high-definition screens, and powerful processors.
Yeah.
By combining these components in clever ways, they can create those high frame rates and low latency needed for truly immersive experiences.
So we're basically carrying around miniature VR machines in our pockets every day.
Yeah,
That's kind of mind-blowing.
it is.
But the article mentions different types of VR.
Oh, right.
Simulation-based, avatar image-based, and projector-based.
Okay.
I'd love to hear more about how those differ.
Great question. Simulation-based VR is likely what most people picture when they think about virtual reality. It's all about recreating specific activities in a realistic way.
Okay.
Imagine a flight simulator that lets you experience the feeling of piloting a plane, or a VR surgery training program that allows medical students to practice delicate procedures without any real-world risk.
Okay, so it's like a highly interactive and immersive version of something that already exists in the real world.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Okay.
So what about avatar image-based VR?
This type is all about social interaction.
Okay.
Think of those virtual meeting spaces where you can see and interact with colleagues remotely, almost as if you're all physically present in the same room.
Okay.
Instead of just staring at a flat screen, you're embodied in a digital avatar that represents you within a shared virtual environment.
So it's like taking video conferencing to a whole new level,
Right.
allowing for more nuanced interactions and a stronger sense of presence.
Yeah.
I can see how that would be hugely beneficial in a world where remote work and collaboration are becoming increasingly common.
Hmm.
What about projector-based VR?
Projector-based VR, as the name suggests, utilizes projectors to create immersive environments.
Okay.
These setups are often used in large-scale installations like those incredible immersive rooms you might find in museums or theme parks.
Okay.
Imagine walking through a virtual rainforest surrounded by projected images of lush foliage and exotic creatures.
Wow.
Or stepping inside a famous painting and feeling like you're actually part of the artwork.
That sounds absolutely incredible. It's
Yeah.
amazing to think about how the technology is evolving to create these diverse and impactful experiences.
It is.
So we've got headsets, motion controllers, treadmills, haptic feedback devices. It seems like the hardware is just as varied as the types of VR experiences themselves.
And it's all advancing at such a rapid pace, it's hard to keep up. Speaking of which, I'm really eager to move beyond just gaming and explore some of the incredible ways VR is being used in other fields.
Me too.
The article mentions applications in medicine, military, business education. The possibilities seem endless.
Me too. I'm especially intrigued by the medical applications. The idea of using VR to treat phantom limb pain or help with Alzheimer's rehabilitation is truly remarkable.
It is.
Let's dive into that world next.
It's mind-blowing how VR is changing the game in healthcare. Take, for example, the use of VR in treating PTSD in veterans.
Okay.
The article mentions a study where veterans with PTSD used VR to revisit traumatic experiences in a controlled environment.
That sounds intense. How does that actually help?
What's fascinating is that by gradually confronting these virtual scenarios, patients can process their trauma and develop coping mechanisms in a safe space.
Okay.
It's like exposure therapy, but with an added layer of control and immersion. The research suggests it can be incredibly effective in reducing PTSD symptoms.
Wow, that's really powerful.
Wow.
It's amazing to think about how technology can be used to address such complex mental health challenges.
Absolutely, and that's just one example. VR is also being used to train surgeons, allowing them to practice complex procedures on virtual patients before ever stepping into a real operating room. It's a game changer for surgical education and patient safety.
I could see how that would be incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
It's like having a high-tech flight simulator for surgeons. And what about the military applications we touched upon earlier?
The military has been using simulations for decades, but VR is taking things to a whole new level.
Right.
The article mentions how soldiers can now train for combat in incredibly realistic virtual environments.
Okay.
They can experience the sights, sounds, and even the physical sensations of being in a firefight, all without any real-world risk.
It's like a giant high-tech version of laser tag, but with much higher stakes.
It makes me think about how video games have become so realistic these days.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a connection there?
Absolutely. The gaming industry has been pushing the boundaries of realism for years, and a lot of those advancements in graphics, physics, and artificial intelligence are now being applied to VR applications in other fields, including the military. That's really interesting. It seems like there's a lot of cross-pollination happening between different industries, each one benefiting from the advancements made in others.
Precisely. And it's not just the military and medicine that are embracing VR. The business world is finding all sorts of innovative applications as well.
Yeah, the article mentions virtual meetings becoming increasingly popular. I could see how that would be appealing, especially in a world where remote work is becoming the norm.
Instead of just being another face on a screen, you can actually inhabit a virtual space and interact with colleagues more naturally.
Right.
It's about creating a sense of presence and fostering a stronger connection between team members, even if they're physically miles apart.
It's funny because I actually had my first virtual meeting the other day, and it was awkward.
Yeah.
We all kind of just hovered around this virtual table, not really sure how to act.
Yeah.
It felt a lot less natural than I expected.
That's a great point. I think we're still in the early stages of figuring out the social etiquette of virtual environments.
Right.
Just like with any new communication medium, it takes time to develop those norms and conventions.
True. It's like in the early days of email, people were sending these super formal messages because they weren't sure how to communicate casually in that format.
Right.
I guess we're still figuring out the virtual equivalent of a handshake or a casual water cooler chat.
Exactly. But I think that's part of what makes this field so exciting.
Yeah.
We're not just developing new technologies, we're also shaping new ways of interacting and connecting with each other.
And it's not just the business world that's being transformed. The article also talks about VR being used in education, from primary schools all the way to universities. I have to admit, I'm a little jealous of kids these days.
Imagine learning history by actually stepping back in time and experiencing historical events firsthand, or studying anatomy by virtually dissecting a human body. VR has the potential to make learning so much more engaging and effective.
It's like taking those field trips we all loved as kids to a whole new level. Instead of just reading about ancient Rome, you could actually walk through the streets of the Roman Forum or witness a gladiatorial combat in the Colosseum.
And it's not limited to traditional academic subjects. VR is also being used to teach practical skills like welding or operating heavy machinery.
Wow.
It's a safe and cost-effective way for students to gain hands-on experience without any real-world risk.
It sounds like there are endless possibilities.
Yeah.
And even outside of formal education, the article mentions VR being used by museums and art galleries to make their content more accessible and engaging.
Yes. Imagine being able to virtually explore the Louvre Museum from your living room or walk through a rainforest without leaving your house.
Wow.
VR can bring the world to people who might not otherwise have access to these experiences, whether it's due to physical limitations, geographic location, or financial constraints.
That's really incredible. It's like democratizing access to culture and knowledge.
Hmm.
But before we get too carried away with all the exciting possibilities of VR, the article also raises some important concerns and challenges. I think it's important to acknowledge those as well.
Absolutely. VR is a powerful tool, and like any powerful tool, it has the potential for both good and bad.
Yeah.
We need to be thoughtful and responsible in how we develop and deploy this technology.
One of the concerns that stood out to me was the potential for VR sickness. I've heard about people experiencing nausea, headaches, even eye strain when using VR headsets.
Yeah.
Is that a common problem?
It can be. VR sickness is often caused by a disconnect between what your eyes are seeing in the virtual world and what your body is actually feeling.
Exactly.
Remember what we talked about earlier with high frame rates and low latency? If those aren't just right, it can create a sensory mismatch that your brain struggles to process.
It makes me think of how I get carsick if I try to read in the back seat.
Yeah.
It's that same feeling of disorientation when your senses are sending conflicting signals.
Exactly. The good news is that developers are working hard to mitigate those issues, and things like higher frame rates, better motion tracking, and more comfortable headsets are all helping to reduce the likelihood of VR sickness.
That's reassuring to hear. But it also sounds like it's important for users to be aware of the risks and take breaks when needed. Like any new technology, it's about using it responsibly and listening to your body. Speaking of responsible use, the article also mentions concerns about the impact of VR on children and teenagers.
Right.
That's a topic I'd love to explore further.
It's a crucial conversation to have. Children's brains are still developing, and they're particularly susceptible to the immersive nature of VR. It raises questions about how these experiences might shape their perceptions of reality, their social development, even their understanding of their own bodies.
It makes you think of how easily kids get absorbed in imaginative play. They can fully believe they're astronauts or pirates completely lost in their own worlds. VR takes that to a whole new level, blurring the lines between fantasy and reality in a way we haven't encountered before.
Exactly, and that's where the potential risks come in. We need to be thoughtful about the types of content children are exposed to in VR and ensure it's age-appropriate. We also need to be mindful of the amount of time they spend in these virtual environments and make sure they're still engaging in real-world activities and social interactions.
It's like anything else. Moderation is key. But it also feels like uncharted territory. We're still learning about the potential long-term effects of VR on young minds.
That's why ongoing research in this area is so crucial. We need to understand how VR impacts cognitive development, social skills, even physical health in children and teenagers. And we need to involve parents, educators, and child development experts in shaping guidelines and best practices for responsible VR use.
It sounds like there's a real need for thoughtful and proactive conversations about how to integrate VR into children's lives in a safe and beneficial way. And speaking of responsible use, the article also touches upon the issue of privacy in VR, which is something that's been on my mind as well. These systems are collecting vast amounts of data about our movements, our interactions, even our biometric information. It's a bit unnerving, to be honest.
It's a valid concern. The amount of personal data being collected by VR systems is unprecedented. We're talking about tracking everything from your eye movements and hand gestures to your heart rate and even your facial expressions. This information can be incredibly revealing, and it raises important questions about who has access to it, how it's being used, and what protections are in place to prevent misuse.
That's like Big Brother on steroids. And the fact that companies like Meta, which already has a somewhat questionable track record when it comes to user data, are leading the charge in VR is even more concerning.
That's why it's so important to have open and transparent discussions about data privacy in VR. Users need to be informed about what data is being collected, how it's being used, and what control they have over it. And we need to hold companies accountable for protecting our privacy and ensuring that our data is not being misused.
It feels like this conversation about data privacy is relevant across all aspects of our digital lives, but it takes on a whole new dimension with VR.
Absolutely. Because VR is so immersive and personal, the data it collects can be even more sensitive and revealing, and the potential for misuse is significant. Imagine, for example, if your VR data was used to create a highly personalized advertising profile, or even worse, to manipulate your emotions or behavior.
That sounds like something straight out of a dystopian science fiction novel.
It does, doesn't it? But these are real concerns that we need to address head-on. We need to be proactive in establishing clear guidelines and regulations around data privacy in VR before it becomes a major problem.
It's a complex issue, but it's one that we can't afford to ignore. Speaking of complex issues, we haven't even delved into the metaverse yet, which the article mentions as being intricately linked to the future of virtual reality. It seems like that's where a lot of these conversations about privacy ethics and the blurring of lines between the real and virtual are going to converge.
The metaverse is still a somewhat nebulous concept, but the general idea is to create a persistent, interconnected network of virtual worlds where people can interact, work, play, and even conduct business. Think of it like the internet, but instead of browsing web pages, you're moving through these 3D virtual environments. It's a vision that has captured the imaginations of tech enthusiasts and futurists alike.
It definitely sounds like something out of science fiction. But I have to admit, I'm struggling to wrap my head around what that would actually look like in practice. What are some concrete examples of how people might use the metaverse?
Imagine attending a virtual concert with friends from all over the world where you can see and interact with each other as if you were all physically present. Or imagine collaborating on a work project in a virtual office space that feels just as real as your physical workplace. You could even attend a virtual conference or take a virtual vacation to exotic destinations. The possibilities are truly limitless.
It sounds like it could potentially revolutionize the way we live, work, and interact with each other. But it also feels like it could amplify all of the concerns we've been talking about. Privacy, security, the impact on children. Those issues become even more complex in a persistent, interconnected virtual world.
You're absolutely right. Building a responsible and ethical metaverse is going to require a lot of thoughtful consideration and collaboration. We need to be thinking about things like data security, content moderation, and even digital identity in this new virtual landscape. And we need to make sure that these spaces are inclusive and accessible to everyone, regardless of their background abilities or economic status.
It sounds like we're on the cusp of a truly transformative moment, both technologically and socially. Virtual reality is no longer just a niche technology. It's becoming increasingly mainstream. And with the emergence of the metaverse, we're talking about potentially reshaping the very fabric of our digital lives.
It's a time of great excitement, but also a time for caution. We need to be mindful of the potential risks as we navigate this uncharted territory and ensure that we're using these powerful tools for good.
Wow, what a journey. We've really gone deep down the VR rabbit hole today, haven't we? From those early, clunky attempts at creating immersive experiences to the mind-blowing possibilities of the metaverse. It's been a fascinating exploration.
It has been indeed, and I hope it sparks some curiosity in our listeners.
Me too. So to wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with this thought, with the lines between the virtual and real blurring more and more each day. Where do we draw the line? And how do we ensure that our virtual lives enhance rather than replace our experiences in the real world? Something to ponder as we all venture further into this uncharted territory. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of virtual reality.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll.